What happens when a retired black schoolteacher gets arrested during a routine traffic stop by officers who don't realize she's the mayor's mother? Evelyn Carter wasn't speeding. She wasn't resisting. She was just driving home from a memorial for her late husband when the lights flashed behind her. What followed wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a moment that exposed something deeper. About power, perception, and what happens when quiet dignity meets unchecked authority. This isn't a story about shouting. It's a story about what stays standing after the noise fades. And it begins, not with anger, but with a woman who refused to shrink. The road was quiet, like it always was at that hour. Birchwood Lane didn't have streetlights, just the soft glow from windows and the occasional porch light flickering through the trees. Evelyn Carter, 68, adjusted her scarf with one hand while the other rested gently on the steering wheel of her aging Buick. She had just left a candlelight vigil at St. Luke's, where neighbors remembered her late husband, Robert. It had been 2 years since he passed, but nights like this still pressed heavy on her chest. As she turned onto the last stretch home, headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. Closer. Then closer again. A police SUV. It followed her for nearly a mile, never flashing its lights, never overtaking, just hovering. Evelyn felt her spine straighten. She wasn't speeding. Her registration was valid. The brake light had been fixed last week. But still, she signaled and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, careful not to stop too close to the ditch. Inside the SUV, Officer Rachel Keene, 34, tightened her gloves as she approached. Her steps were firm, assertive, the kind that made people flinch even before a word was spoken. Evelyn rolled down her window, folding her hands in plain sight on the steering wheel. She didn't speak first. Years of experience had taught her to wait. "License and registration," Keene said, not looking at her face. Evelyn complied without hesitation. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. "You were swerving," Keene said flatly. But they both knew that wasn't true. A moment passed, the officer's eyes narrowed. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Evelyn blinked once. The moment wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Anyone watching would say she wasn't resisting. But something about her composure made the silence feel charged, like someone was being tested. For older viewers, this moment cuts deep. Because they've lived it. The quiet stops, the vague reasons, the way your dignity is weighed and dismissed without a word, and the awful understanding that if you push back too soon, too hard, things can go very wrong. Evelyn knew all that. So she nodded, reached for the door, and stepped into the cold. She kept her head high. Not in defiance, but in memory of Robert, who always told her, "You don't owe anyone fear." As she stood beside the car, hands now being guided behind her back, the chill of the cuffs wasn't what she noticed most. It was the look on the rookie officer's face standing nearby, uncertain, silent, watching. And as Evelyn was led toward the squad car, one thought echoed in the back of her mind. They don't know who I am. Not yet. The ride to the station was slow. Not rushed, not chaotic, just quiet. Officer Keene didn't say a word. The rookie, Officer Blake Harlan, barely glanced back. Evelyn sat in the rear seat, wrists stiff behind her, shoulders pulled back like she had practiced this posture her whole life. She wasn't angry, she wasn't pleading, but she wasn't small either. When they arrived, Evelyn was guided inside without incident. A few heads turned. A night sergeant at the desk lifted an eyebrow but said nothing. Her name wasn't asked. No Miranda warning was read. Instead, she was told to sit in a cold plastic chair while paperwork was filled out. It was as if no one knew or cared what this was really about. But Evelyn never looked away. She didn't slump. She didn't sigh. She simply watched the room, the way teachers used to scan a classroom full of students. Calm, measured, quietly in charge. Older viewers will recognize that look. It's the one you learn when you've raised children, buried a partner, sat through meetings where your voice wasn't heard, not because you didn't speak, but because they never planned to listen. It's a look of someone who has survived more than she's ever told, and who knows that silence isn't weakness. It's timing. At one point, Officer Keene raised her voice. "Do you understand why you're here?" Evelyn turned to face her directly. "No," she said softly, "but I understand why you think I should be." There was no bite in her tone, no sarcasm, just truth. Truth that unsettled, truth that lingered. Officer Harlan shifted in his stance. His eyes dropped for a moment, just long enough to show discomfort, maybe even doubt. Because in Evelyn's face he didn't see threat, he saw steadiness, and it didn't fit the narrative he had been trained to expect. The desk sergeant cleared his throat, broke the tension, and asked for Evelyn's full name. She gave it. "Evelyn Carter," she said. The pen in his hand stopped, for just a second, because the name meant something. Carter, like Mayor Daniel Carter, the man who'd led Birchwood for 3 consecutive terms, the man who had spoken time and again about building bridges across generations and color lines, the man who always ended his speeches with, "My mother taught me better." That mother was sitting right there, wrists still cuffed. But none of that was spoken aloud. Instead, Officer Keene walked away, muttering something under her breath, and Evelyn stayed seated, spine straight, eyes forward. This wasn't over, but it had started, exactly the way she feared it might. Quietly, disrespectfully, and just maybe, predictably. The station buzzed with routine. Phones rang, printers hummed, keys clacked against worn keyboards. But something about Evelyn's presence made the noise feel distant. Not because she made a scene. She didn't. It was the stillness around her. The kind that draws attention without asking for it. A younger officer across the room nudged his partner. "That's the mayor's mom, isn't it?" The whisper barely broke the air, but it spread quickly. Sergeant Doyle, 54, a man who'd served under 3 different police chiefs, paused mid-step when the name clicked. He didn't speak. He just looked. Looked at the woman in handcuffs, sitting without slouching, without panic, with the same composure she had when she used to run Sunday programs at the local library. He remembered her. Everyone who'd been in Birchwood long enough did. Evelyn Carter wasn't famous. She was familiar. And that, for many in town, held more weight. Officer Keene didn't notice the shift. Or maybe she did, and chose to ignore it. She pushed forward with processing, fingerprints, mugshot, intake form, routine steps meant for real offenders. But with every snap of the camera, every press of a fingerprint pad, something cracked. Not in Evelyn, but in the room. Because everyone watching could feel it. This wasn't about the law. This was about power used the wrong way. Viewers in their 50s, 60s, 70s, they've seen it. Maybe not on camera, but in their neighborhoods. In offices where a firm no from a woman like Evelyn meant losing an opportunity. In courtrooms where dignity was mistaken for defiance, and in stations like this, where silence could cost you, and speaking up could cost you more. Sergeant Doyle took a deep breath and approached Officer Harlan. "You know who that is?" he asked quietly. Harlan nodded. "I didn't." "She didn't say anything." "She didn't have to," Doyle replied. There was a pause. Not heavy, but sharp, the kind that rearranges priorities. And then, without warning, Evelyn looked up. Not at the officers, not at the camera, at the clock on the wall. "I was supposed to call my grandson at 9, she said softly. "He reads to me every Thursday night." No anger, no request, just the truth, placed gently in the room. Officer Harlan turned toward Keene. "Maybe we should." "She's being processed like anyone else," Keene cut him off. But the room had already shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational. It was the quiet realization that this stop, this arrest, this whole moment wasn't just wrong. It was unnecessary. And soon someone was going to have to explain why it ever happened at all. Chief Raymond Sellers had seen enough late-night footage to know when something didn't sit right. At 62, with retirement 6 months away, he wasn't looking for trouble. But that night, something told him to check the logs before heading home. The name Evelyn Carter flashed across the screen, and his hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. Not an Evelyn. Not someone Carter. The Evelyn Carter. Raymond had spoken with her at 3 town halls, watched her lead after-school literacy programs, even shook her hand at her husband's funeral. She wasn't just the mayor's mother. She was the kind of woman who could silence a room with a single look, not out of fear, but out of respect. He opened the body cam footage. The silence in his office grew heavy. Officer Keene's voice played first, sharp, clipped, authoritative, in a way that didn't match the situation. No clear cause for the stop. No visible traffic violation. Evelyn's voice, by contrast, was calm, composed, never raising her tone, never making it harder than it needed to be. She stepped out of the vehicle as instructed. She didn't argue. She simply stood there. Hands visible, eyes steady. Raymond leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled at his lips. For older viewers, this moment hits hard, because they've waited for someone like Raymond to notice, to watch the tape, to acknowledge what others would have ignored. This isn't the moment justice is served, but it's the first moment someone in power doesn't look away. The footage continued, Keen's hand gripping the cuffs too tightly, Evelyn quietly asking, "Is this necessary?" Keen saying nothing in return. Raymond reached for the intercom. "Call in Officer Keen, now, and tell Internal Affairs they'll want to see this." His voice was low, but final, not out of rage, out of certainty. Outside his office, word had already begun to ripple. A few officers had seen the booking. A few more had heard whispers about Evelyn's identity. But until now, no one had acted. Raymond didn't care about politics, didn't care that Daniel Carter was the mayor. What he saw wasn't about family ties. It was about judgment, about power used without pause, and about the cost of letting that go unchecked. As the video ended, he watched one frame linger, Evelyn standing under the station lights, her hands bound, her expression unreadable. She hadn't needed to say who she was. The camera had done it for her. The station never issued a press release. No one apologized. No one said the words out loud. But by Friday morning, the story had already left the building. A local journalist, Latasha Green, 41, former student of Evelyn Carter, had gotten a text from a cousin working the front desk. "They arrested Miss Carter last night. No charges yet. She's still in the system." Latasha didn't need more than that. She made one call, then another, and by noon, a single photo began circulating on social media. Evelyn, seated in a cold plastic chair, hands cuffed, eyes forward. No headline, no caption, just the image. But it didn't stay silent for long. Justice for Evelyn. It began as a whisper. A few former students, a retired librarian, an old friend from church. But by evening it was trending statewide. By nightfall, national accounts had picked it up. Comment sections overflowed with disbelief, anger, sorrow. Some remembered her reading at their elementary school. Others remembered how she'd volunteered to tutor their kids when the city cut programs. One man wrote, "She taught my daughter how to hold a pen right, and you're telling me she's a threat?" For viewers in their 60s and 70s, this wasn't just another hashtag. It was a reminder that their dignity could still be violated, even after a lifetime of doing things right. They'd seen this before, but now they were seeing it through the eyes of their own generation. Evelyn wasn't a stranger. She was one of them. In Birchwood, the response wasn't digital, it was personal. The church she attended unlocked its doors early for prayer. Her neighborhood started placing white lilies on doorsteps in solidarity. And by Saturday, over 200 residents, many of them retirees, parents, and former city workers, gathered silently outside the station, holding signs that read, "I am Evelyn." But not everyone in the department stayed quiet. Officer Blake Harlan stood behind the tinted windows of the precinct, watching the crowd. The weight of his silence from 2 nights earlier pressed heavy on his chest. He hadn't spoken up, hadn't stopped it. But seeing those signs, seeing his own grandmother's face reflected in those protesters, something shifted. Inside, Chief Sellers made the call official. Officer Keen was placed on unpaid suspension pending internal investigation. Her badge and weapon were collected that afternoon. No cameras were there to record the moment. But someone from the front desk caught the look in Evelyn's eyes when she came to retrieve her belongings. Calm, steady, unshaken. She hadn't posted a word online, hadn't told anyone to protest. But something about the way she had endured, not with rage, but with restraint, had spoken louder than any tweet. And the world had finally started to listen. The podium was simple, just a folding table set outside Birchwood's community center. No microphones, no stage, only a low hum of voices, neighbors, friends, people who came not to argue, but to listen. Evelyn Carter stood at the front in her Sunday coat, hands clasped in front of her, not clutching a speech, not holding a phone, just standing. In the quiet that preceded her voice, even the wind seemed to slow. "I've been asked why I haven't spoken sooner," she began, eyes scanning the crowd. "The answer is simple. I wasn't waiting for attention. I was waiting for the noise to clear." There were no chants, no applause, just nods. The kind that come from people who understand restraint, not as silence, but as strength. I don't believe every officer is cruel. I don't believe every department is broken. But I do believe that when we pretend not to see what's wrong, when we stay comfortable with being almost right, we become part of what's broken." Her voice never rose. She didn't name names, didn't condemn anyone, but her words cut clean. Viewers in their 60s and 70s know this cadence. They've heard it in living rooms during hard conversations, in eulogies that had to explain too much, in courtroom statements that had to stay composed even when the heart wasn't. Evelyn's son, Mayor Daniel Carter, stood to the side. He hadn't spoken yet. He wouldn't. Not today. This wasn't his moment, and he knew it. He watched his mother, the same way he used to as a boy when she corrected him without ever raising her voice. "I wasn't arrested because I was a danger," she said. "I was arrested because someone believed their badge gave them permission to forget my humanity." Her words didn't shake, but Officer Blake Harlan, standing in the back, felt something shift inside him. Not guilt, not shame. Something deeper. A recognition that power isn't always about who speaks loudest, but who stands longest. After the speech, Evelyn didn't stay to take pictures. She didn't talk to the press. She stepped down, accepted a hug from an old neighbor, and walked with her grandson to the car. Someone in the crowd whispered, "That's how you lead." And they were right. Because in a world full of shouting, Evelyn Carter reminded people what real authority sounds like. Calm. Measured. Undeniably clear. The old Birchwood Library had been closed for years. Its paint was peeling, the lawn overgrown, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. Most people passed by without a second glance. But Evelyn Carter saw something different. Not just a building, but a space where voices could grow. 3 months after her arrest, a handwritten sign appeared on the library door. "Renovations in progress, future home of the Carter Center for Justice and Civic Education." There was no fanfare. No ribbon cutting, just volunteers, retirees with carpentry skills, teenagers from the local school district, off-duty officers who came after hours and didn't speak much, but stayed until dark. Evelyn was there every day, sweeping, sorting through donated books, making tea in the break room even before it had electricity. She never gave orders, she gave time. For older viewers, this moment is quietly profound. Because they know change doesn't always come from protest signs or headlines. Sometimes it starts when someone says, "We're not just going to complain, we're going to build." The Carter Center opened without ceremony. No press, no cameras. Just a soft open on a rainy Saturday. Inside were 3 small classrooms, a reading lounge, and 1 large wall with framed photographs of Birchwood residents who had shaped the town's better moments. Teachers, nurses, bus drivers, veterans. People whose names didn't make the news but whose impact lived on in memory. In one corner, a modest sign read, "Know your rights. Know your neighbors." Workshops began that first week. Sessions on civic engagement, on de-escalation training for young officers, on helping seniors navigate city services. A few city officials stopped by, not because they were invited, because they were curious. What Evelyn was building wasn't just a building, it was structure. Where silence used to live. Officer Blake Harlan eventually volunteered to teach a weekly class on community interaction. He didn't say much about the past, but when he arrived, he always paused at the front steps, as if asking for permission to enter something larger than himself. And Evelyn, she kept her same rhythm. Early mornings, fresh flowers on the windowsill, her grandson sometimes reading aloud to the younger kids in the lounge. No cameras captured these moments, but in every quiet nod, in every hand raised during a question, the same truth echoed. She had turned what tried to break her into something no one could ignore. Daniel Carter had delivered dozens of speeches as mayor. He'd stood at memorials, fundraisers, emergency briefings, his voice practiced, firm, calculated. But when he stepped into the Carter Center one rainy Thursday afternoon, he didn't speak. He sat. Not at the front, not with his aides. Just quietly in the back of a civic education workshop, listening as a retired public defender explained how to file a complaint against an officer. No one announced his presence. Evelyn didn't turn to acknowledge him. But when their eyes met for a brief second, he nodded once. She didn't smile, she just moved on with the lesson. That was how it started. For weeks, Daniel kept returning, sometimes to observe, sometimes to learn. He didn't show up as a mayor, he showed up as a son. And gradually the difference between the two began to blur. For older viewers, this is the turning point they understand deeply because they've raised children. They've waited years for them to truly get it. And when it happens, not with grand gestures, but through quiet transformation, it's worth more than any headline. 6 months later, Mayor Carter introduced a motion for a full audit of Birchwood's police conduct over the past decade. He proposed the creation of an independent civilian review board with seats reserved for retirees, educators, and youth representatives. He didn't mention his mother in the press release. He didn't need to, because everyone knew. Some critics called it political theater, said he was bowing to pressure. But those who had seen him at the Carter Center, taking notes, staying late, asking questions, knew better. They saw a man no longer protecting the badge, but protecting the values his mother had embodied his entire life. And Evelyn? She never praised him publicly, never gave interviews about his reforms. But when asked once, during a community lunch, how she felt about her son's new direction, she stirred her tea, looked up briefly, and said, "He finally understands the difference between power and purpose." That was all. But that was everything. The Carter Center continued to grow. New volunteers arrived each week. Retired officers taught alongside former defendants. And in the front window, where the town once posted overdue library notices, a simple poster now hung. "This is what accountability looks like when you stay long enough to water the roots." 10 years passed. The roof had been replaced, the ivy was trimmed, the sign out front now read, "Carter Center, a space for justice, memory, and learning." On most mornings, the bell above the door chimed not for headlines or ceremony, but for everyday people walking in with quiet questions. What rights do I have at a traffic stop? How do I help my grandson if he's being profiled? Where can I learn how to speak at a city meeting? Evelyn Carter never stopped coming. Her walk had slowed. Her hand sometimes trembled. But every Tuesday morning she sat by the east window with a notebook, a pot of tea, and a circle of younger women who came not for advice, but for steadiness. They didn't call her Mrs. Carter, just Miss Evelyn. And they stayed long after the tea went cold. For viewers in their later years, this part feels familiar. Not because they've built a center, but because they've spent their lives building something. Families, churches, unions, classrooms, and they know legacy isn't a statue or a plaque. It's a pattern, a rhythm that keeps going even when they no longer lead the way. Officer Blake Harlan now headed the town's community liaison unit. He brought in new recruits to the Carter Center once a month for a roundtable with local seniors. No uniforms, no weapons, just stories, some hard, some healing, all real. Mayor Daniel Carter had long since stopped mentioning the reforms in campaign speeches, not because they weren't important, but because they had become normal, embedded, expected, the way they should have always been. And Evelyn? On the 10th anniversary of the center, she didn't give a speech. She simply opened the door that morning, just like she always had. A child ran past her into the hallway, waving a flyer about a youth writing contest. A retired officer followed behind with 2 new folding chairs. Someone called from the kitchen, "Miss Evelyn, we're out of sugar." She smiled. Outside, on the bench beneath the front window, a small plaque had been added by the community without her knowledge. She didn't shout, she didn't storm, she stayed. For the viewer who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or judged too quickly, this is the payoff. Not because Evelyn fought louder than anyone else, but because she never stopped showing up. And in a world that moves too fast, forgets too easily, and honors too late, her presence was the quiet proof that truth doesn't fade, it waits. And when spoken, even gently, it echoes. In a world where noise often drowns out truth, Evelyn Carter's story reminds us that real strength doesn't always come from raising your voice. It comes from standing your ground with quiet dignity. She didn't need outrage to defend her worth. She needed patience, clarity, and the courage to keep showing up. The first lesson is this: kindness is not weakness. It is the bravest response to injustice. When Evelyn chose to build instead of blame, to act instead of accuse, she gave the next generation a blueprint for lasting change. The second lesson: you don't need power to make an impact, just consistency and the willingness to be present when it matters most. Finally, her journey teaches us that justice isn't only about laws or courtrooms, it begins with how we treat one another every day. When you listen instead of dismiss, when you help someone understand their rights, when you speak up gently but firmly in the face of wrong, you are holding the door open for justice to walk in. And sometimes that is enough to transform not just a single moment, but an entire community. Evelyn Carter didn't march for recognition. She didn't build the Carter Center to prove a point. She did it because some things are worth protecting, even when the world looks away. Dignity, truth, the right to be seen as fully human, no matter your age, your skin color, or how softly you speak. If you've ever watched someone stay calm while being wronged, if you've ever witnessed quiet strength change the course of a conversation, a room, or a town, then you already understand the kind of power Evelyn carried. And now, it's your turn to answer. Comment 1 if you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Comment 2 if you still believe that kindness can lead to real change. If this story moved you, stay with us. Subscribe to hear more stories that don't just make noise, but mean something.